This is the first of two short videos explaining why there is no climate crisis, how atmospheric carbon dioxide levels have little or nothing to do with the Earth's climate, and how the current cult of supposedly catastrophic man-made climate change risks leading the West into making the greatest scientific and economic blunder in human history. These videos are based on my recent book, There Is No Climate Crisis, available from Amazon. In this first video, I will explain why we shouldn't trust any of the exaggerated claims of the climate catastrophists. In the second video, I will describe what is really happening to the Earth's climate. We can start this story about 100 years ago. At the time, there were a series of terrible heat waves. Some of the worst heat waves were in 1911, 1921, 1923, and 1934. These heat waves affected the whole world, and many tens of thousands died. At the time, most climate experts believed the Earth was warming, and that this would lead to melting glaciers and ice caps, causing a possible rise in sea levels of up to 40 feet, flooding coastal cities, destroying low-lying countries, and killing millions. However, in the 1940s, the warming seemed to stop. There were some record cold winters, and by the 1960s, the Earth had started to cool. This cooling led to the next great climate scare, that global cooling would lead to more extreme weather like droughts and floods, and the death of millions. These are exactly the same warnings we're now getting about supposed global warming. In the 1960s and 70s, the Earth became so cold that climatologists predicted the onset of a new ice age. Even the British Guardian newspaper, which had spent the last 30 years or so screaming about catastrophic man-made global warming, was assuring us back in the 1970s that the Earth was cooling and we were headed for a new ice age. The scientists predicted that global cooling would lead to crop failures and famines. In fact, in 1967, one expert warned that it was already too late to prevent famine by 1975. The situation was believed to be so serious that in 1972, the world's leading climate scientists held a conference at Brown University in New York and drafted a letter to the US president warning him about the terrible consequences of global cooling. The US CIA also got involved and in 1976 wrote a report about food shortages, political unrest, and wars that global cooling would cause. Various scientists came up with ingenious solutions to global cooling. One idea was to cover the Arctic ice with black soot to absorb more heat. Another was to put sterility drugs into food to control population growth so mankind could better cope with expected famines. By 1978, climatologists doubted global cooling would ever stop. Yet, within a couple of years, it did stop, and the Earth started warming again. So, no need to cover the Arctic with black soot, and no need to put sterility drugs in our food. Now, let's look at some of the main claims made by today's climate catastrophists. One of these claims is that global warming would melt the Arctic ice cap. In 2007, the once respected National Geographic warned us that the Arctic ice cap would be gone within 5 years. A year later, in 2008, the National Geographic upped the ante and predicted the Arctic ice cap would be gone that year. When that didn't happen, the experts moved the date of the Arctic ice's demise to 2013. It then moved again to 2014, then 2015, and then 2016, and so on. Now the scientists predict that the Arctic ice cap will still be around till 2035. The climate catastrophists are experts in presenting terrifying charts, which are eagerly picked up by careerist, headline-hungry journalists. This one shows how the Arctic ice has been declining for years. But we have to be careful when looking at these charts. Here you can see why the climate catastrophists decided to start their chart in 1979. 1979 was a record unusually cold year in the Arctic. So, it's hardly surprising that Arctic ice has been declining since then. And anyway, if increasing CO2 is causing warming, which will supposedly melt the Arctic ice by 2035, how was it possible for an American submarine to surface in ice-free water at the North Pole in 1958 when CO2 levels were much lower than they are now? Oh, and by the way, in case you were worried about the polar bears, ever since a treaty in 1973 which limited hunting of polar bears to 900 a year to be killed by local people using traditional methods, polar bear populations in the north have been thriving. Anyway, in spite of the climate catastrophists' seemingly endless dire predictions of the disappearance of Arctic ice, the Arctic Sea isn't actually terribly important. It only represents about 0.06% of the world's ice. The main accumulations of ice are Greenland, with about 13% of the world's ice, and the Antarctic, with around 85%. Greenland's ice cover has been increasing for at least the last 400 years, pretty much ever since the medieval warm period, and the Antarctic is adding about 82 billion tons of new ice every year. Some people may remember the 2014 expedition to the Antarctic by a group of courageous climate activists. Their ship, the academic Shokalski, got stuck in the ice that the global warming computer models said shouldn't be there. Then a Chinese rescue ship also got stuck in the ice that shouldn't have been there. Finally, the climate activists had to be rescued by a helicopter from a third ship. Moreover, several Antarctic research stations have disappeared under the increasing ice, so the latest one had to be built on hydraulic stilts. These stilts allow the research station to be raised each year to keep it above the increasing ice and snow. Now, let's look at sea levels. Sea levels do seem to be rising. Here's New York and Florida. But CO2 emissions are shooting up. Yet the rise in sea levels seems to be constant. There doesn't seem to be any relationship between sea level rise and increasing CO2 levels. Climate catastrophists like to terrify us with grim predictions of apocalyptic flooding from rising sea levels. But even the normally climate alarmist IPCC admits that there has been no acceleration in sea level rise for about 100 years, in spite of rapidly increasing atmospheric CO2. What's actually happening is that we're in the middle of an interglacial, in which ice has been melting for over 20,000 years, and this has resulted in a large rise of sea levels of around 100 meters. This rise is now flattening and has nothing at all to do with the last 100 years of rising CO2 levels. Next, wildfires. Climate alarmists and scientifically ignorant journalists love wildfires. After all, what better picture of a supposedly overheating Earth could there be than out-of-control wildfires destroying forests, homes, and wildlife? But we have to be careful when experts and alarmists start bleating about supposedly record wildfires. Journalists are quick to pick up on the shock horror stories of devastating wildfires supposedly caused by man-made climate change. Here, the New York Times claims that 10 million acres a year burned in 2015 were, I quote, the most on record. But if this supposed journalist bothered to read his own newspaper, he'd see that in 1937, almost 22 million acres burned. That's rather more than the supposed record 10 million acres burned in 2015. And if the journalist had taken a couple of minutes to check the records of the US Department of Agriculture, he would have seen that between 40 and 50 million acres a year burned in the scorching hot 1920s. We're also told that extreme weather is increasing, but the figures on tropical storms and hurricanes don't show any increase. In fact, there seems to have been a slight decrease over the last 50 years in spite of rising CO2 levels. Moreover, the Washington Post went into a panic in 2016 because there weren't enough hurricanes. Fortunately for the Washington Post, there were a couple of decent-sized hurricanes the year after, and even better, the Washington Post found a way to blame President Trump. The climate catastrophists particularly like to use Australia, with its floods, droughts and wildfires, as an example of impending climate chaos supposedly facing the world. Here, one of the world's leading climate experts predicts Australia will alternate between Mad Max, a drought-blasted wasteland, and Waterworld, massive floods due to supposed catastrophic man-made climate change. Had this great expert thought of using Google, he'd have found that Australia has been alternating between droughts and floods for at least the last 200 years.